take the shutter apart. The rear lens group unscrews easily enough. Typically you just unscrew that with your fingers, there's no need to use a tool. Here's our retaining ring. In the lens shim we have a paper shim and a metal shim. They're not optional, they need to go back. The front lens group, just bayonets in. I've given this a quick clean because I was interested to see what sort of a state it's in. It appears fine. That brings us to the shutter itself. Someone's been in here. You can tell someone's been in here because it's missing the little screw that would have locked the retaining ring in place. And the retaining ring doesn't appear to be screwed down properly. So there could be anything going on at all. Yeah, that's loose. To remove our retaining ring, oh, there's the screw. That's the retaining screw there. What's it doing there? That's why the retaining ring wasn't down tight. This tab was not correctly placed in the fork. The aperture lever doesn't really want to move, it's sticky. Let's take this ring off the front. That's the shutter speed settings cam plate. Anything odd here? Nothing immediately jumps out, that all looks complete. Just remove the shutter release lever. It's the internal cocking ring, take that off. There's the main pinion that cocks the cam here. We'll unhook the mainspring. See what sort of state it's in. I think it's tied. It is. If you take this as your 12 o'clock, that's at about 4 o'clock. That's a very tired spring. Here's the main cam. Nothing odd about that. We'll carry on stripping this down. Two screws for the retard gear train. One screw for the delay action or self timer. I'll cock this. Unhook this spring so it's not under tension. Remove these two screws. Just reclaim that screw. Here's the top plate. Take out the moving flash contact. Take out this little piece. The shutter blades, as you can see, are very oily looking. I need to remove this spring now. It's easiest if you put something behind that arm so it can't swing away, and then you can pull the spring out slightly and unhook it. No, it's not doing it for me. better. That way you only have to move it, pull the spring out a little way to unhook it. If you don't block the action of this lever, it will swing away and you have to stretch the spring right out. Let's take this little pallet wheel off here. This is the B lever. There's a screw at the pivot. It also has a spring on it. We need that off. Take the B lever off and the B lever spring, which is this one. Just unhook that and lift it carefully away, because you don't want it flying across the room. There's one more delicate spring right here. I've just unhooked it so it's no longer under tension. Now I can lift it away. It's stuck to my tweezers. Alright. You can see the oil in there? That's not normal. At the back of the shutter, 3 screws. They hold the outer case to the main case. This one here is not an original screw, it's one that I found to put in its place. The flash contact wire here, I need to just loosen that screw off. It wasn't really tight. The curved rack and the piece that push the cocking action away are both quite oily. They were sticking to the inside of this shutter case. Yeah, it's a shutter case. Alright, so the aperture lever wouldn't move before. I can see looking at that, it's just sticky with oil. The shutter blades, likewise, the shutter blades, if you look at them, they're very oily. Alright, well I think I need my block of wood to work on here. 3 screws here. Hold the lever on that controls the diaphragm blades to set the aperture. Move the setting lever, that was really stuck there with oil. See the colour of that? That's supposed to be shiny, silvery looking nickel. The shim is really gummed up with oil. And this lever here sets our self-timer or the flash sync. Look at the green paint on here. This shutter must have done virtually no work at all. Normally that's got the paint knocked off the end of it just from normal use. Okay, 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and case together. Oh, that's really tight. such tiny screws, they have no business being as tight as that. Alright, so the case and mechanism plate should split. They do. You can see the amount of oil on that mechanism plate, and the blades are just glued to that plate with oil. And the mechanism plate, we can disassemble this further. We'll remove the 3 screws that hold the lens tube in position. One of the 3 screws is longer than its mates. Because it passes through this little bracket that holds the main spring. Let's take the lens tube off. And here we can lift out the blade actuating ring. That's the piece that moves backwards and forwards to open and close the shutter blades. That's very oily. As is that. Let's have a look at the case. Those blades should be out. Normally they would just fall out. They can't fall out, they're glued together with oil. We have our diaphragm blades in the case here. Now, see if they move. They're still stiff, means that the blades are sticky, which doesn't surprise me seeing the amount of oil in here. Given the amount of oil, you know, it's conceivable that some bright spark oiled the shutter. It looks too much to be just oil that's sweated out of the grease in the focus helical. So here's our case. You can tell by the yellow tinge there that that's very oily. And our diaphragm blades come out as a neat rosette. And this is extremely greasy. Look at the rainbow colour of that. Okay. So I think we can say that the shutter was in no danger of ever working in that state. So I'll have to get to cleaning this with some cotton buds, Q-tips and naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, until I've got all these parts oil free, and then things can be reassembled. So I'll start with this case. That oil's so old and thick that it's just about polymerised into a lacquer. Given another decade, it probably would have done. Then you'd be trouble getting this thing apart. Useless Q-tips. These are the ones that are on a wooden stick at least. Most of the ones I see available are on paper sticks. and they are useless for this sort of thing. Well, you get the gist of this. I'm going to have to go through and deal with the entire shutter, all the bits and pieces in this fashion, and then put everything back together. You can watch me put it back together. Well, after a considerable amount of time spent cleaning, it took ages. I have some parts all degreased and ready for reassembly. So I'll start here with this mechanism plate, I think. So I'm just positioning the detent spring there so it's conveniently placed. I can slide this underneath it, drop the blade actuating ring into position, hook the detent spring in position, goes behind this stud. That spring looks remarkably bent to me. I don't know that that's in a good state. We know terrible things have happened to the shutter because someone has clearly put oil or something in here. The lens tube goes on here. It only goes on one way because you'll see that post there, the brass piece is chewed off. That's so it can fit against that pin. Right, that just dropped into place. Now we'll just have to find the screws for it. We have 3 screws that look very much the same. One of them is slightly longer than its mates. There's also one from the rear of the case, which looks almost the same as something else. That one, and that one, I think. So the 2 short screws go here. And here. The long one goes round here. You've got to have our bracket in place. And if you mix these screws up and put a short one where the long one should be, it'll only be going halfway through the mechanism plate, which is only aluminium, and when you try and tighten the screw up, you'll probably strip it. But if you don't, and you put a long one where the short one should be, in one of these other 2 positions, it'll stick out through the mechanism plate. And it'll catch a shutter blade. And if it catches a shutter blade, the shutter of course won't work. Okay, so that's all in there and moving. It is degreased to death, this, so there's no lubrication of any sort in here. I'm going to lubricate this with graphite powder. Just not quite yet. I want to do the case first and get the diaphragm in that. I've got this jig I use for assembling the diaphragm. Now this plate goes on, this is the cover plate, that rivet sticks up. We've got 5 blades to go in there. The blades are all interleaved, which means that there's no first blade and no last blade. All the blades are on top of one blade at one end and under the next blade at the other. Let's get this one in. So getting the first one or two in is easy. Just a case of placing them on the plate. But to get the last ones in, you've got to swing the first ones out of the way. I'm using a toothpick here to help me position the blade, get them seated. Right, now we're already at it. I've got to swing this blade out of the way so I've exposed the hole in the plate for the next blade. And now I've got to pull those 2 blades back out of the way to expose the hole for the last blade. Now I have to lift these blades over the top of this blade without disturbing anything. And hopefully the 5 pivots are still in their respective places. This plate goes on next, and I happen to know it goes on here. Now one of those pivots is not coming up through here, which suggests that one blade is out of position. We'll see if we can rescue that, because otherwise I've got to start placing the blades again. Alright, so there's the blades all sitting there, and that may work out well or it may not, we'll find out. The case goes on. Now there's 2 holes close together here. One's a screw hole and one's a rectangular hole. That rectangular hole goes over this little rivet. Now why you'd need a rectangular hole for a circular rivet? That's a question, isn't it? And I don't know the answer to that one. I'm flipping this jig over, popping it up there like that, and got a bit of rubbish there from somewhere, don't know where that sprang from. It's not sitting flat, so I can tell that one of those blades is not in position. However, I'm going to start the 3 little screws that hold this plate in place. Just start them and no more. And then I'm going to see if I can get the blades seated correctly, because one of them is obviously out of position. In an ideal world, this all goes smoothly first time. But my hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Alright, let's have a look, see what we can see. Okay, well this blade here, I can see that the pivot is not in the hole. So let's see if I can nudge that blade across. appears to be now. It's in the hole. Turn these up very lightly indeed. Let's flip it upside down and see if the blades move together. They do. Nothing's out of place. That action's very smooth and easy. So those 3 screws, I can nip them up. Now when you're doing these screws up, don't go crazy. It's only going into the aluminium case, and it's very, very thin and it's very, very soft. And if you go crazy doing those screws up, you will strip them out. There's nothing surer than that. Okay, so there's our diaphragm. It's moving smoothly. If you've got one of these, and these diaphragm blades are not as flat as I'd like them to be, and they're not as flat as I'd like them to be because they've been covered in oil, and then someone's had a go at moving the controls, and basically what that means is it stresses the blades up because you're pushing at one end and they're glued down at the other end. They just bow up, so they get a spring to them. So this one works reasonably smoothly, but if I wanted to make sure, if I needed it to work a bit smoother than that, what I'd do is I'd drop some graphite powder in around here, around the edge, and then I'll just work it backwards and forwards. Or I might drop it in here where the ends of the blades are visible in those little slots and work it backwards and forwards and then blow it all away. Now that's only to be done with a freshly cleaned shutter that has absolutely no trace of any oil in it, because otherwise the graphite powder will clump up on the oil and you'll end up with lumps of it doing no good. And any graphite powder that's loose will find its way onto the insides of the lens surfaces, and it'll degrade your image quality because you'd end up with flare as a result. I'm just going to apply a bit of graphite to this. We'll see how it goes. Right, I've got this sitting in a little container here, which is where I normally do my graphite powder work. I'm just spreading that out, making sure that it's spread evenly. Just move that backwards and forwards. Okay, that'll do. Now, I'm just going to take this outside with my rocket blower and blow all that graphite powder away, and everything should work very smoothly after that. Alright, so I'm back, and this moves very smoothly indeed. So that's all looking good. There's a little tiny thread of cotton there, I'll get rid of that. It's when cleaning with these things, you will leave little threads of cotton about if you're not careful. Take the time to check and make sure. Alright, so there's our diaphragm in the case, all looking good. And I'll get my mechanism plate now. And deal with this. I'm going to use some graphite to lubricate this. Now there's a couple of latches here, and here, and here. They'll drop in and prevent the blade actuating ring from moving. So I'm just making sure they're not in the way. One of them is. Which one is it? One of them's dropped in and it's stopping my blade actuating ring from moving. That bugger, I think. I want this free so I can work the graphite powder into it. That's good, that's all positioned. Now you could lubricate this with molybdenum paste or graphite grease or something else if you so desired. But graphite powder has the advantage that it'll leave a little coating on the surfaces, the friction surfaces, and it will never get sticky. It won't gather up dust over time. That's moving very nicely. So I'm just going to go and blow that graphite powder away and we can put the blades on here. Right, well I'll make sure my blade actuating ring is where I want it to be, which is this way, with the blade actuating ring against that post. And we'll put the blades in position. Unlike the diaphragm blades, which are interleaved, shutter blades are just laid one on top of the others. So there is a first blade, there is a last blade. Sometimes the position of the first and last blade is very important, and that depends on the shutter. Alright, now this case needs to go over here. It only goes on one way. This slot here lines up with that slot there. This hole here lines up here, and so on. So I just need to lower this over the top. Line up the 3 screw holes and put the screws in. Now they're flathead or countersunk screws. Do them up very lightly. Very lightly indeed. There's always a possibility that when you put the case over the top, you've knocked one of the blades out of place so that it's no longer seated around its pins and is seated on top of the pins. If you tighten the case screws up straight away, you could end up crushing the blade and causing damage. I'm just checking that it opens and closes smoothly, and it does. And I can tighten the 3 screws up. Now the action feels a little stiff, and it'll be because of the tension on this detent here, this detent spring. It's got no lubrication on it at all because I've cleaned it exceedingly thoroughly. So I want some molybdenum paste now to put on that pin there so that as it moves across, moves that spring out of the way, it's not rubbing. It's not a high friction area, because otherwise it certainly will be. Take a little bit of molybdenum paste, just put it on that post in the spring. That's nice and smooth now. You see how it drops back in position nicely. So our blades are in the case, and I can start assembling all the control gear which controls the action of the shutter. Now there are a few areas on the shutter here that need to be lubricated. I'm using molybdenum paste here. The blade actuating ring has got two posts on it, on the arm here and here. Now both of those need to be lubricated. That's where the main cam picks up the blade actuating ring and moves it. This point here on the blade actuating ring, that's where the B lever drops in. This point is where it latches here for the self timer. And I'm just running some under there. That catches the end of this little lever. It gets pushed back out of the way by the blade actuating ring. I'm just making sure that's not unlubricated. We don't want any rough spots. Alright, now I've got to start putting springs in place. Of course the springs are always going to do their best to get away, so I want a really good set of tweezers to attack these. This pair normally gets me by, but they're not quite up to it, they're a bit slippery, need some treatment. I've got another pair that'll help me.